Hi everyone, welcome to today's live stream where I'll be talking about QGIS expressions, variables, data-defined symbology, and tying this all together to make awesome flexible projects that work really well, look beautiful, but most importantly, easy to work with so they don't become like a big nightmare of maintenance. Can I just get a confirmation from somebody that you can hear me okay from the chat window? Can anyone give me a thumbs up to say yes? Uh, Great. Okay, I've got confirmation. I can keep going. Thank you. All right. So, like I said, hi, I'm Niall Dawson from Australia, where it's currently 5 a.m. Probably going to wake up my kids doing this again, so if they sneak in the back, that'll be them. Um, Thanks for joining me once again. We did one of these sessions a couple of weeks ago on the new time handling capabilities coming with QGIS 3.14. I really enjoyed it. I had a great fun time running that demo, so I thought let's do it again. And this time we're going to really dig into some of the power of QGIS. Uh, I love teaching this. Whenever I do my in-person training, it's something I like to spend a lot of time on because I think when you kind of this concept clicks in your brain and you understand how it all works together, all of a sudden like the possibilities in your mapping just like your mind explodes. Um, so I'm excited to be able to do a session on this. Let me switch across to my QGIS window. All right, so the very first thing we're going to go through today, uh, let me, hang on, I'll put myself back here. Hey, the first thing we'll go through today is I'll dig through a little bit about how expressions work in QGIS. Then we will look at variables and explore what they actually mean, how to use them. We'll look at data-defined symbology and how you can use expressions to change the appearance of things in your map. And then we're going to do a bunch of little challenges and tasks that but take these three concepts and sort of tie them together to make different outcomes. All right, so the first thing we're going to cover is functions. So for functions, at their most basic, most people kind of experience them in QGIS at the very first time through the field calculator, which is this little button up here. So let's have a look in here in the field calculator. So field calculator is the ability to sort of populate an existing field or a new field with a value that's been defined by an expression. When we hit that button, we get this window up here with an expression builder. And we'll keep coming back to this expression builder widget again and again throughout today's session. But to break it down, we've got a few things here. First off, we've got the area on the left-hand side here where I can actually type my expression. So I can put in little expressions like 1 plus 2. One of the most important things in this window is down the bottom here, the preview that we can see, where we get a live kind of feedback of, first off, the current value of my expression that I'm typing here, but also if I've made a mistake. So if I've done something and put in an expression that doesn't quite make sense, like here we've got, we haven't finished off the expression, we get the nice little feedback immediately that something's broken. We've got to fix that before we can keep going. So that's on the left-hand side of this expression widget. Underneath it, we've also got some buttons which just put in little helper common bits of expressions that we tend to use a lot. So things like plus and minus equals, exactly the same as if you typed it in on your keyboard as well. But if you forget, they're sitting down the bottom there, so you're always kind of accessible. Next off, in the middle here, we've got the second most important bit of the QGIS expression builder. So this part here lists a whole lot of different functions that are available for use in my expression, and we get the help over here on the right hand side for them. So let's have a look at one. Let's expand out the string section here and have a look at the upper expression, the upper function, sorry. So you can see when I click on it in this list, the context help on the right hand side updates to show me the actual the help for this particular function. So upper, for instance, over here describes it as converts a string to uppercase letters, gives a bit of a breakdown about how to use that, and then really usefully, there's examples at the end. So you can see here, this expression, if I put this into my builder over on the left-hand side here, here's the result that I expect to see with the arrow, and you can see it's worked okay here. So whenever you get stuck, this is where you go. You go to this help section in the middle, you can look for your function, you can search for them by name if you're not quite sure what it was. So if I start searching for upper, it's filtered out the list here, and I can see again that help string on the right that describes exactly how that function should be used. Okay, so that's our expression builder, the widget here. Now, there's a couple of things to know upfront about QGIS expressions. First off, a lot of people ask what language is this? When I'm typing in a little expression here and I'm doing my upper and all that sort of stuff, is it Python, is it JavaScript? The answer is it's none of those. It's its own expression language, which has been built specifically for QGIS. But saying that, it's been built in a way to mimic SQL expressions. So if I take my upper function, for example, that one's basically lifted straight from the SQL standard. So you'd get the same result if you used upper in Postgres or SQL Server or something like that. It'll work the same way. So this expression language has been designed to be kind of SQL-ish, but it's kind of SQL plus a lot of extra stuff. So it's almost like you've got SQL, but then it's actually a bit more Postgres-ish. So it's kind of like when there's ambiguity, we follow what Postgres does, but then it's kind of PostGIS on top of that because there's a lot of spatial functions here as well. If we look under like geometry, you can see there's a whole lot of different functions here that relate to spatial objects. So things like a function that gets me the centroid. So it's kind of like the closest similar language would be PostGIS. The other thing to keep in mind is that the QGIS expression language is what's called a functional language. So everything is done using functions. And the expression that I build here actually has to be like a single line, sort of like a single command built up of chaining functions together. So let's have a look at this. Let's do a really simple expression and I'll get my uppercase function from over here. If I find a function in this section here, I can just double click to bring it over onto the left-hand side. So if I get my uppercase function, I'll look under the fields and values section to find a field that exists in this table I'm looking at, in this case name. I've got to wrap it in the brackets there to close off that function. This is not terribly helpful, this one, because there's a whole lot of nulls in this name thing. Let's try a different one. No, doesn't like that one either. Trying to find a well, this data set wasn't a particularly good one to pick. But what I want to show you first off, there's a couple of traps in this expression builder that a lot of people fall into. So the first one is if you want to type in a string directly, like a literal piece of text that isn't part of the, it shouldn't be evaluated as part of your expression. You need to wrap that in single quotes. So if I do like a single quote and I type in, this is my text, you can see the preview out here is basically exactly what I typed in. So the single quote is a string value in my expression builder. If I change this to double quotes, this is actually the SQL way, and so it works in QGIS expressions, of saying this is a reference to a field in my table. In this case, my table doesn't have a field called this is my text. And you can see the little error here, messages saying the column this is my text wasn't found. It doesn't exist here. So there's a difference. If you use single quotes, it means just take that bit of text as it is. If you use double quotes, it means get the value from the field with that same name. So there's a little trap that a lot of people fall into first off. The second one that we have to be careful of is null values. So you get a lot of things where in your spatial data, you might have null values as part of a table. And null values have their own kind of special rules about how they work when you're putting them into functions. So basically, if I did something like 5 plus a null value, the result's actually null. It's not 5 like I'd get if I did 5 plus 0. This null is like a special empty value that basically kills everything else in my expression. So we've got to be careful about that. I'm not going to dig too deep into that. If you're interested in those concepts, do a search you could do a search on QGIS expressions in the QGIS documentation, or just SQL null in general, and the same rules will apply to QGIS expressions. Another little thing that I want to show you in QGIS expressions is that things inside QGIS expressions, so values I use, they have different types. So you can have number values, you can have string values, you can have date time values, geometry values even. But QGIS tries to be a bit flexible in its expressions, so it's not like ultra strict about how they're treated. Good way to demo this is if I type in a string that's actually a number, like 1, 2, 3 here. So this is a string value. I've put it in the little quotation marks, single quotes. That means it's a string that contains the number digits, 1, 2, 3. But I can do something like this, multiply that by 2. QGIS doesn't really care that this is a string. It's been forgiving and it's decided, well, it's a string, but it's actually a string that I can treat as a number. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to be pedantic about forcing you to convert this actually into a proper number before I'll let you do a mathematical multiplication on it. I'll do that for you. So there's different types of values in QGIS expressions, but it likes to be forgiving and it tries to take away some of that work about converting between them as much as possible. All right, so field calculator was one of the very first things that expressions were built for in QGIS, but they quickly kind of spread throughout the whole of QGIS. So when they were first added to field calculator, it was sort of great. Everybody liked using them to update field values. But it was quickly realized that they could be used in so many other places in QGIS. So today, if we go into my QGIS, some common uses for expressions would be things like having a label text that changes that's built off an expression, select by expression, rule-based renderers, all these kind of stuff use the same QGIS expression language. So you can take expressions from one part of QGIS, use the same sort of thing in other parts of QGIS. So let's have a look at that to start with. If I have I've got a layer here, just a simple point layer. I'm going to bring up the styling doc for this one and have a look at the label tab. So at the moment, this layer has been styled with using the name column from this data set. I could drop down this list up here and pick a different field from that. So if I change it to say locality, you can see my labels updated to show a different field value from that table. If we actually want to change this and we want our labels to show something that's not present as one of the existing fields in the table, I can hit the little button to the right of this widget, which brings back up my standard expression expression widget like we saw before. So I could change this and I could say, actually, I want my labels here to be an uppercase version of the name, followed by the space and the locality. So I've just strung this expression here together to say, get the uppercase value of the name column, followed by a space. This little character means concatenate. So add these strings together. So we put a space there, and then we put a space, and then the locality. And you can see here my labels have updated. So now I've got my name in capitals, followed by a space, followed by the locality as it is. So we can use expressions here to show to change the label text dynamically. Another really common use of expressions is in the select by expression dialog up here. So let's click this one, same widget up here. But this one lets me type in a little expression to do a selection based on that. So if I said, find me all the ports where the locality is Southeast Queensland. Oops. So my expression is the locality equals Southeast Queensland. Actually, here's a really good example of the difference between the double quotes and the single quotes. So we have our field name is in the double quotes and the value, the text string is in single quotes. I can do select features. We've got three matching ones, and you can see those three features that match that expression got selected. So that's another use of expressions, really common use, that select features using an expression option. Another part of QGIS that expressions are used quite a lot on an almost daily basis is in something called a virtual field. So you can have a virtual field, which is basically like a tricky extra little field that's been added to my table. Looks like a normal field, but it's actually calculated dynamically whenever we need that value. Rule-based renderers are something else that expressions are used a lot in. And they're basically scattered everywhere. You can even do things like anytime you see one of these little controls that lets you type in a number in QGIS, you can put in a QGIS expression here and it will evaluate it straight away. So if I did something like this, 10 divided by 1.2, I could put in the little expression. When I move away, it's calculated immediately. So any kind of QGIS expression would work here. I could do as complicated as I want, 10 divided by 9 plus 8 times whatever, 1.2, and I get my value straight away. So same expressions, same expression language, syntax used all throughout QGIS. Right. Let's have a look now at something called variables, because this is where we start to get the real power of QGIS expressions out. So to demonstrate this first off, I'm going to make a print layout. So I've just made an empty print layout here, and I'll put in a new text label in my print layout, and delete the default text from that. So in my print layout label, we can put in expressions here from the insert an expression button. So I click here, I'm going to hit insert an expression. And this time I'm going to scroll down here to the variable section of the expression builder. If I expand this out, you can see a whole bunch of these things called variables that I've got access to. And in this case, I'm going to add one to my label, which is the project file name. The project path. So you can see when I click project path here, the helper text over here says that this variable contains the full path, including the file name of the current project. The current value is etc. etc. Let's put that in there. Oops, I didn't double click. Sorry, let's do that again. Project path double click to put it over into my expression. All right, so now my print layout label contains the current path to the file, the project file. But I haven't typed that in manually. So it's like a little bit of dynamic text that will update. If I went and saved this project somewhere else, let's save it to expressions v2, bring back up my print layout, you can see that label's dynamically updated straight away, taking the current value of that project path. So here's a little tip for you. Whenever you're making a print layout in QGIS, I tend to put in my template something like this down the bottom where I've got my project path, and then I'll do something like this, put some brackets in there and insert the variable called layout name, so that I can see when I print this out, I've got first off a reference to the file name, but I've also got a reference in here in the little kind of metadata section of my layout to which layout that actually is. This can be a huge help if you've got a massive project that might have 30 different layouts, and you need to just reprint one of them. If you don't have that bit of text in there, you have to sort of dive through the project and actually find out which layout you're referring to. But I can use that layout name variable here, like I've done, to dynamically insert that. And again, it's a dynamic piece of text, this variable. So if I went and I renamed my layout, master map, there we go. So it's updated straight away. So in here, again, variables are a special little value you can put inside your expressions that contain a dynamic piece of text that's generated automatically for you. You can recognize a variable because it's always prefixed by a little ampersand, at whatever, the little a circle symbol. So all these variable names are prefixed by that same symbol. All right. Now let's get to some meaty topics. One thing that is important and is actually fantastic about QGIS expressions is that they're context dependent. So I'm going to demo this by, let me just turn off some layers of my map. I'm going to change my ports label here to something a bit strange. I'm going to change this to the variable that's called map scale. So map scale, the variable contains the current scale of the map. 269 is the current value, which matches my scale down there. Let's put that here. All right, so now we're actually labeling these features with the current map scale. And as you'd expect, as I kind of change my map around, I zoom in, and the labels are changing because my map scale is changing. But if I made a second map here by doing view, new map view, where did that go? This window. The scale of this map is different to the scale over here. And you can see the same expression, my at map scale, is giving me different results depending on where it's being evaluated in QGIS. So in the main map over here, where my scale is 1 to 600,000, we get one value. In my second map, where my scale is 1 to 1 million, we get a different value for my labels. If I went into a print layout again, put a map in here, at a different scale again, say 50,000. I'd have to find, okay, so this scale, 400,000. The same expression is giving me a different result depending on the actual context that it's evaluated in. So how does that work? Let's have a look. When I went into my labels to set it to map scale, if I have a look here, under this variable section, You can see I've got a lot of choices here of variables, including a whole bunch of ones here that are map variables. So we've got things here like the map scale, got map, or like the center point of the map, the width and the height of the map in map units, rotation, a whole lot of stuff that relates to the actual view that that map is being rendered in. If I instead went to something like my attribute table and I say, let me do a expression-based filter on this attribute table and look in variables, I don't have those map ones here anymore. So I've got some variables. I've got things like my project path and that I looked at before, but none of those ones like map scale are available anymore. It comes up if I do a search because it was a recent one, but there's no value for it, and it doesn't show when I look under variables. It's missing. So we're seeing different choices on what we can put into our expressions depending on where we're actually building those expressions. So you might ask, why don't we have the map scale as a choice when we're doing this, an expression-based filter in my attribute table? The reason is because this attribute table, it's not directly linked to any map view. I could have multiple map views in my project. Let's put a few more in here. And they might all have different scales. When I bring up an attribute table, if I was to try and say, put the map scale variable into an expression in my attribute table, there's no way of saying, well, actually, I'm getting the scale from this map, or this map here, my map 2, or the main map, or even the map from my layout, because possibly my layout might be the one that is visible behind here, and it's not directly linked. So we don't see the map variables showing in that context. Similarly, if we went into a field calculator in my layout properties, we also don't see the map variables showing here. Because again, the field calculator, it's not directly linked to a map view. You could have multiple map views in a project and you don't know which field, which map you want to calculate using the scale for that. So the way this works is that QGIS expressions are context dependent. We get different values depending on where they're being evaluated, and that context is also controlling what we can use inside that expression. I've got some Lego bricks here to demo this. So basically, we have this concept of these things called expression context scopes, and they build off each other like Lego bricks. So you have things like in one context, you'll have a whole bunch of variables relating to your project. When I'm evaluating an expression in my map window, I get a second set of variables added on top of that, which relate to those map settings. We can explore this a little bit further from the ground up. If I go into my settings option in a QGIS window, settings options, there's a tab here called variables. You can see here, when I go to my variables tab, we've got a bunch that have been pre-populated for us. These are in italics because these ones are actually ones that QGIS generates internally. So I can't change these. If I can't double click on these or change the values of them. But you can see we've got a bunch of useful ones here. So things like there's one that's been automatically created with the user account name and my user full name. So that's sort of taken from the operating system user profile. We've got ones for QGIS version, QGIS version numbers, also like the operating system name and the current locality. So all these ones that are listed in this settings option expression variables tab are things that apply across the whole QGIS install. So it doesn't matter which project I've got loaded in, it's still the same QGIS version. It doesn't matter which map window I'm looking at, we're still using the same operating system, or it still has the same logged in user account. So these variables here are ones that are called global variables. They apply across the whole of that QGIS install on that computer. We can actually set it up here. These are the global variables. In this little editor, there's a plus button down the bottom where I can hit this one and make my own global variables. So one I might make here might be the organization name. And let's put in North Road. So I can make my own set of variables which are stored globally in QGIS. So it doesn't matter which project I load on that computer, that same organization name variable will be available for use. We can see these ones here. The ones I've added manually don't show in italics, and I can get in there and I can double click and change those values. So I can say, actually, I better fix this and do PTY LTD on the end. I can change these ones, the ones I've made myself. I can't change the built-in ones. So now we've made one here, a global variable for organization name. Let me bring up my print layout again. Where was the one? This one. So let's say I put a label into my print layout, get rid of that default text, and I'll insert in here under the variables section. If we have a look, that new organization name variable we made is available here for use. You can see again that the current value over here. So I'll put that into my expression builder, and it's put that little bit of text in there now. So my layout label is set to follow that organization name variable. Let's put the value in there. If I go back in here, and let's change this, get rid of that extra bit. It's still a dynamic value, so it updates when I refresh that layout because it's just taking the value of the @organization name variable. I've got a question here in the chat window about changing a date time field or getting a string into date time. I might cover that a bit later if I've got time because it's a little bit off topic for this. Right, so my organization name variable is one of these global variables that I've set up manually, and they'll apply regardless of the project that I've got loaded into QGIS. So that's kind of like the bottom building block of our QGIS expression context is the global variables. The next one that sits on top of that is something called project variables. So let's put that one there. We can see these ones through our project properties window. So project properties also has a variables tab here. And you can see when I go in here, this is where a whole lot of project related automatic variables are coming from. So things like the project path that we saw before is coming from that project scope. We've got ones like project file name, the project CRS, author, all this other kind of wonderful stuff. But we can also see at the top here, there's a little collapse section for my global variables. And the reason this is because like we've seen with our Lego bricks, these contexts stack on top of each other. So in my project, whenever I'm evaluating a expression inside a project, I've got the option of using variables from the project or those global ones that are available regardless of the project. Now, one really cool thing about QGIS expression variables is that they kind of act a bit like CSS if you're used to web development, where you can override things from at a lower level. So if I went down here and I add a new project variable and I call this one organization name, and let's say my organization name for this particular project is actually qgis.org. I'm doing it under a different name because whatever. So what we see here now is I've made a new variable in the project scope with the same name as something that matched my global scope. And it's put a little cross here to actually show me, well, this is the global value for that variable, but it's not applying in this anymore because I've overridden it down here for this particular project. If I look in here in my layout now, the project value for that variable has overridden the global one, and now we're actually seeing a different result for my label. So this is kind of neat. I've got my default organization name that I've set up for my whole install, and all my print templates use that organization name to say produced by. But for one particular project where I'm doing it under a different name, I can override it and decide for this one, I want a different value for my organization name. I don't have to make a new template for it because my template's just using that variable that's been overridden for one particular project. So we've got now our global variables that can be overridden by the project variables. In the when we saw in here that we also had variables like the map ones, this is another set of context, another context that's been added to make available for those variables. So this is the map context basically, where we've got all those things available. The map scale, the map rotation and such are available because our labels are directly associated with a particular map view. So when QGIS is rendering these labels, it knows which map it's being rendered in. If I had multiple ones, it knows exactly which map this is referring to because the label is sitting inside a map. So we have like a map scope as well that's sort of sitting on top of our global and our project ones. There's a map level one too. We've also got to finalize this picture. There's layout level scopes and layout item scopes. So if I have a look in my layout under general properties here and I scroll right down, you can see I've also got a variable editor here that applies to this whole layout. And the variables for my layout, so first off we've got the global ones, then we've got the project ones, and then we've also got layout ones. So again, I could decide for one particular layout in my project, I might override this value for organization name and change this to Great Maps Inc. So now we're not taking the value from our global organization name anymore. We're not taking it from the project one. We're actually overriding it specifically for one particular layout inside a bigger project. And now this is the value that's being used inside my layout item organization name. So there we go. So we've got this concept of variables that are built up off the top of each other, and they can override values from a lower priority part of that expression context. All right, let's dive back into my map view. Let's change this one back to something a bit more sensible. And we're going to look at something called data-defined controls for symbols. Because this is the last part of our puzzle about how to make these wonderful adaptive QGIS projects. So data-defined controls are, let me load a new layer into my project actually. I'll just put this one in. So this is just some town locations from the natural earth data. I'll make this a little bit bigger and a little bit less ugly. All right, so now I've got some towns showing on my map here. When we talk about data-defined, actually, I've got a question over here in the chat window asking if a variable's value can be an expression. It actually can be, and there's a function called called eval, E-V-A-L. So this one, if you wrap that around a variable that is itself an expression, it'll all work as you want. So yes, you can do that. Right, if I look in my symbology tab for any layer, and I go into my symbol settings, you'll notice that there's a whole lot of these little buttons that sit to the right of controls here. And when I hover over it, it gives the tooltip says it's a data-defined override. These are next to almost every single setting inside QGIS symbology and labeling and print layouts and all this kind of stuff. So you can see I've got them sitting next to my size, next to my fill color, stroke color, all the way down to things like the offset. If I change the symbol type to a, let's say a font marker, I've got them next to the font family, all this kind of stuff, the character to show. And what these little settings actually let me do is they let me control on a feature by feature basis if the value for that property should be changed based on the actual feature that's being rendered. So the easiest way to demo this is, let's say I want in my map here, I've got my labels switched on. Let's make these a little bit smaller again. Let's say I want to make the most important cities, the biggest ones, their labels should be bold and they should be a bit bigger. So there's two ways you could do this. So one way would be to set up multiple different layers and you filter them out to say, this one is only my important ones, this one's not, and we'll style them differently. You can do that, but then the problem is your project starts to become more difficult to maintain because now you've got two copies of that layer that you have to sort of keep in sync, and if you want to change how the coloring of one, you've got to apply it to another. You could do a similar kind of thing using a rule-based label system, but again, you're still managing multiple sets of label settings. Whereas all we want to do is we want to keep everything else the same font, same color, but we want our big cities like the capital to be shown in bold and the rest just in the normal text. This is a great use for these data-defined overrides. So in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to click on the little data-defined button next to the bold setting. And I'm going to hit the edit button to bring up my expression builder. And I need to type in a little expression here, which will evaluate to a true value for my important cities and a false value for my not important cities. And the way I'll do this for this particular data set is I'm going to look at there's a scale rank field, and I want to say if my scale rank is less than or equal to 3, then it's an important city. So basically, the smaller the scale rank in this data set, the more important that city is. And there we go. So now, as QGIS is drawing each of the labels for those features, it's evaluating that expression to check if the scale rank is less than or equal to 3. And anytime it is, the label gets rendered in bold. So you can see this one here. Where's my scale rank for this feature? There we go. Its value is 3. This one here, its value is 7, so it doesn't get rendered in the bold. And I think there's another one up here somewhere. Maybe not in this data set. Yep, so now my capital has been rendered in that bold text because it passed that little expression that I put in there where I've said, draw it in bold only if for this particular feature, that scale rank value, it matches that criteria. I could do the same sort of thing for my font size. So I could say, let's build an expression here. And for my, my font size, I'm going to say I'll use a SQL-ish case statement. So again, if you if you haven't seen these before, do a Google search for SQL case statement and you'll find an explanation. But I'm going to say case when scale rank is less than or equal to 3, then my font size can be 18, otherwise it can be 13. And when I do that, you can see my Brisbane label there just jumped up because now it's the only one being rendered in that font size of 18. The rest are getting the font size of 13. So basically, as it's labeling every one of these features, it's evaluating these little data-defined overrides to decide if on a feature-by-feature basis, we need to change the value that we've preset in here. So they're called overrides because they're basically ignoring this value I've typed here and replacing it with something else, but dynamically, feature by feature. So this one here, it was quite, for my size data defined override, we needed to write a little expression here that returned a number. So it's basically the font size in points is the value we're returning here. For something like a color setting, like here, we've got a data defined color. Let's try and make the capital city red in this case. So we'll go case when, let's say when the name equals Brisbane. Then for a color setting like this one, we actually return the color in a HTML color syntax. So I could do like hash FF0000, otherwise black. So we can see here, so as it's deciding the color for each feature to render, it's checking that name. If the name is Brisbane, then this is the value that it'll get, the color value, FF0000, which is a red color, otherwise black. And there we go. So now we've got a red label for my Brisbane one. We can tell that when I did my edit, there's this handy little bit of text down here that lets us know the expected value that we need to get back from this expression. When I did it for my size, you can see here the expected format, so the value that it expects to get back out of this expression has to be a double, so like a numeric value with a decimal point possibly, and it has to be greater than or equal to 0. That kind of makes sense. Like we don't want a font size to be less than 0. Doesn't make sense. For my color one, the little helper was saying it wants a string value and it wants it to be like a hash RRGGBB hexadecimal sort of HTML style color value. All right, so that's the basics of how you set up data-defined settings for a symbol. We can do the same sort of thing from the labels, and we can do it in the symbols as well. So for my actual symbol style, so I could say in here, my symbol style, I also want this one to change. Let's see if I can use the same expression even. So when the name is Brisbane, we want a red color, otherwise we want black. And there we go. So we can use the same expression as a data-defined override for my marker fill color as well. Now there's two special little tricks that we can use with variables and data-defined overrides when we're styling our map here. One of them is there's a really common task that people want to do where, I'm just going to reset these ones back again. To reset this, clear that color. If we were actually styling this layer as, say, a categorized renderer, let's do it by scale rank for now. So we've now got a thematic map showing these places by one of the attributes in the data there. It's changing the color for them. A common task that people will ask about is how we'd actually get the labels to match the same color as the markers themselves. So one way would be, again, to set up data defined overrides for each of those different criteria. So you could say in my expression, I could write one that says case when the scale rank equals 1, then this is the color value when the scale rank equals such. That gets pretty complex quickly because first off, your expression is going to be massive. And then secondly, if you change any of those colors, you'd have to go back and update that expression. But there's a really nice thing when I go to put a data defined override on the label color. We can see there's a variable over here that it's sort of hinting to us called symbol color. And this one, this variable contains the color of the symbol used to render the feature. So let's put this in as my label color override. And you can see now what it's done is for each of these features, it's actually taken the color from the categorized renderer and used the same color for the label. The great thing about this is if I go in here and I say, oh, that's pretty horrible, let's fix up some of these colors and make this something more readable. My labels are updating at exactly the same time. It's taking that same color as my little marker symbols. So I don't have to try and manage two sets of rules, don't have to manage two sets of colors as I change them. It's just using that wonderful symbol color variable to say, get me the same color as my symbol itself is rendered in. So now I could go and I could fix up my coloring to make it something more usable, and I only have to change it once. We get that nice immediate feedback as well when we're changing the categorized colors. Let's reset this back again. And I'll clear this one as well. There's one other really special variable that's available in symbology, which is there's a variable here that's just called value. Now this is a funny one because this one, first off, it doesn't have much help. But secondly, what this actually does is the value variable gives me the value of whatever's been put into this widget here. So usually when I put a value in for my expression, it's an override. So if I put in a value here, let's say it's 19, it's ignoring whatever's put into this size field now. It doesn't matter what I change this to because the data defined override is wiping that out and saying, nah, don't use that. Don't use whatever I've put in here. You actually need to use the result of my expression instead. But this kind of magical value variable, this actually just returns the same value as I've put into this widget here. So this lets me do something like I could say case when my, what was that field called? When my scale rank is less than or equal to 3, then get value and double it. Otherwise, just use the value. So my expression looks a bit funny now because we've used value here twice. But let's have a look what this does. So now when this expression is being evaluated, it's taking the value from this widget, replacing that at value part of my expression with whatever I've put in here and giving me the result. So now I've got the flexibility to actually change these values using the interactive widget, and you can see my data defined override has sort of adapted to that. And now we've still got our Brisbane label, the capital city label is twice the size of everything else, but I've got the ability to get in here and still customize the font size dynamically. So I haven't baked this value in. I've used this magical little at value variable to just say replace it with whatever I've put here. This works for all this sort of stuff. So you could say at value when it's used for a color override would actually be the value of the color I've put here. When I use it for a say a font's name one, it would actually be the value of the font name that's been picked out here. So it's a special little one that you can use to mean that you've still got that ability to interactively control things, but adapt them feature by feature. So we've still got our double-sized Brisbane label, but we can change things dynamically still. All right, got a few minutes left, and this is where I'm going to tie all these concepts together to teach a few tricks that let you make projects which use expressions, variables, and data-defined controls to tie them all together. All right, so the first thing we're going to do here is I'm going to teach a little trick that I like to use a lot when I'm making maps. Whenever I'm making a map project, I tend to go into my project properties, the variables tab, and I'll make a new variable in here, which I'll call label font. And I'll give this a name, what's a font on my computer? Let's just put Arial for now because I know it's there. So I've set up a project variable called label font, and I've given it the name of a font here. When I go into my data-defined overrides for any of these labels, these layers that are labeled in my map, I can pick to set this expression to match one of those variables that I've set. So I'll set it to my label font variable. So now my font that the labels are being rendered in is taken directly from this label font variable, which is currently set to Arial. And I could go and I could say all of my different, for all the different layers in here, I'll set them to follow that label font variable for the font name. We'll just label well, let's see. So I might have, 50 different layers or something in a complex project. And I've set them all the ones that are labeled, to take the font name from the label font variable. The reason I'll do this is because I tend to do things where I'll get sort of 80% of the way through a mapping project and then decide, I think actually the problem with this map is that the font choice was wrong. That font choice I made right back at the start when I was putting all those labels onto my map wasn't a great choice, and I actually should have used a different font. That means that I would have to go back through and I would have to edit all 50 layers and change the font for each of them. I'd have to go back through one by one, say change my font to something else, and hope that it gives a better result. Because by the time I've done that, I don't want to have to return and revert all those changes. If I've used a variable for the font name, it means I've got one place that I have to change that. So I could go back in here and I could change this to say Comic Sans as my label font. When I refresh my map now, all of the labels in my map that are using their label font variable as an override for the font name have been updated in one go. So I've got one place now that I can change that will that I can use. One place to say, let's do Calibri, and test different fonts to see which one I actually want to use for my final map, instead of having to go back through 50 different layers, change them all, and hope that we're getting a better result. So it basically means we've saved a whole lot of work. We've now got one place to change a setting that applies across the board for my map. I'd actually do a few things in here. I'd probably go in and I would have a variable on a project level for label font for my most important things. So it might be like label font important, and maybe this one's a different font. Maybe this one is Comic Sans for my most important labels. And then I choose on like a layer by layer basis which variable I want to take that from. There's like a little mini hierarchy. It still means I can change one place to update a whole bunch of layers. And I probably would do things in here as well and set up ones for like the default label size. So maybe my default label size for this project is 9. When I'm labeling my layers, I'm going to say take all these ones, get my default font size from default label size, We'll go back here and do it for all of these ones. I do it when I'm first setting it up. And now I've got one place I can go and say, let's fix this. That wasn't quite right. My labels need to be bigger across the board. One place I can change it applies across my project. So I can now do these kind of whole project level tweaks, even though I've got a massive project that's got 50 layers in it, and it's sort of at that 90% stage where it's the little bits, changing a font size by half a point might make all the difference in an awesome map or a terrible map. All right, here's another tip. Here's another tip. I really like this one. Let's get rid of some of these labels. We don't want this one. Let's turn this one off. I'm going to turn this one off too. Okay, so if I had, oh, this is bugging me too. So let's fix this. All right, so we've got my label set up for this layer here, for my populated places label. In this case, what I would generally do in a project like this, I don't like how these labels are being placed. What I want to do for this project, let me zoom out a bit. I'm going to just fake some settings here until I get the result that I want to see. Sorry, just give me a second to tweak this stuff. All right, here. Yeah, this is good. Okay, so I've got my project has been set up. I've got some labels here for populated places. Here's the scale that I'm working on that I want to print it out at. I would get to this stage and I'd get a bit frustrated with my project because I want to follow those sort of time-honored cartographic principles where a label for a feature that is sitting on a coastal boundary actually should be labeled inside the water part. If you look in any old sort of cartography textbook, that'll be one of those rules that they'll teach you. I remember learning it when I was studying cartography at university, and I really like it. So I want my map here to respect that. So what I want to do here is I want to set up a data-defined override so that the labels which are sitting along my coastal areas actually have to sit out into the water area. This one here, for instance, I'd want that to sit up here. This one here especially, that should be sitting up in the water area. The automatic labeling by default in this case has decided the bottom left's a better place because I put a rule in here to say minimize putting labels over the boundary of my state boundary layer. So what I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to first off go into my fields for this layer, and I'm going to make a new field, and I'm going to call this one, my field's called is coastal, and we'll use a numeric integer type is fine for this. Okay, so we've now got a new field in that layer called is coastal. I've got a question here actually in the chat window about what base map background I'm using here. It's not a standard one, it's just a vectors rendered using some nice QGIS settings. Sorry, I can't. I might cover that in a future topic. But anyway, so now we've got a is coastal field in this layer. And I'm going to set this up. So I'm going to say in my label for my places under the placement tab, when I've set this to the cartographic mode, there's this option here that I can set as a data defined setting for the position priority for my labels. So I'm going to go in here. When I look in my edit there, I've got a visitor again. You're going to say hi to everyone? All right, so my little help text here for the expected values for my my position priority data defined control gives us some strings here. So it says my expression should return a comma separated list of placements in the order of priority. So my expression for this one is going to look like this. So case when my new is coastal value is 1. Then the placement override string. My mic's getting all tangled up. My placement override string here is going to look like this. So I prefer for my coastal labels, first off, I want them in the top right by default. So TR, you can see down here is the string which represents top right. If you can't do it in the top right, put it in the bottom right. If you can't do that, just put it on the right of the feature. Okay, so when it's a coastal label, this is the priority string we should use. We should use the top right, followed by the bottom right, followed by the right. So that's my position priority data defined override. The last thing I need to do is none of my features actually have a is coastal value yet. So I'm going to have to go in here and I have to say, let me select one of these features, and I'm just going to update this. So is coastal is 1 for this particular feature. You can see when I did that, the label moved straight away. So let's undo that. When I didn't have is coastal set to 1 for that, it's using the automatic placement, which is decided bottom left. When I changed it to an is coastal, now it's being restricted to my data defined overrides, which said for my coastal ones, it can be top right, it can be bottom right, it could be on the right, or nothing. They're the only choices that's allowed for my coastal ones. So now I can make a selection of all my coastal towns. Let's get these ones, Mackay, these ones, Bundaberg, Harvey Bay, and some down here. I'll use this button that does multi-attribute update. Set all these ones that is coastal to 1. And there we go. So now my coastal labels, my coastal towns have all been restricted to say, put your labels on the top right, the bottom right, or the right, and don't allow them to sit on the left-hand side. So now we've got that that nice cartographic principle where my coastal towns are actually labeled inside the coastal regions. So there's a little trick. So in this case, what we're using is a data-defined override for the position priority, and we used a new field that we made for this particular project. All right. Now, for the last thing I want to cover today is one of my all-time favorite tricks inside QGIS for making great adaptable projects. I'm just going to reset some of my settings here again because I want to get back into here. I'm going to get back to the stage where, if I still got this expression, yeah, here we go. Just put this one back. Okay, so we're back to our map where we've set up that data defined override. So our capital city is in a bold font and bigger. I'm really happy with this map, how it looks here. But let's say in one of my print layouts that's attached to this project, I've got this map sitting here, and I actually don't want that. Like it's not a good fit for one particular layout inside my project. So in general, I like it. For my 99 other layouts inside that project, having the capital in bold is a good choice. But this one layout here, I don't like it being in bold. This is a sort of thing where it can get really tricky if you don't know the right way to approach it, because you could set up different themes and maybe you link that map to different styles. But we can actually do it all through data-defined overrides. Now, the thing that I want to teach today with this is there's 2 ways we could do this. So one is like a bottom-up way, and the other one is a top-down. I'm going to show you the inferior way first, and then I'll show you the better way. So probably the standard way that someone would go about fixing this, to say in this one layout here, I don't want my labels to be bold, but in the rest of my layouts and the rest of my maps in this project, I do, is you would go and you would say, I'm I just have to do so. I'd click on this map. I would find the ID section, and first off, I'd give this map a fixed ID. So I'm going to call this one my state layout map. Okay, so now this map's got a fixed ID called state layout map. Let's copy that. So one approach to this would be to go back into my main canvas, go into this data defined rule and say, let's do it for this one, for the size, and say, first off, case when we've got a variable here called map ID, and you can see the map ID variable is the ID of the current map destination. So it will either be canvas if it's being rendered here, or the item ID if it's inside a layout map. So I could say when the map ID is state layout map, then all my labels should be size 13. We don't want that capital to be bigger. Otherwise, it goes to that secondary rule, which is based on the scale rank. So let's have a look at this again. So we're saying if the map ID is my state layout map, all the labels in that layer should be 13, regardless of the scale rank. But otherwise, use this special rule here that says they're scale rank dependent. So let's have a look. In my canvas, still the same result. We've still got the label size like that. When I refresh this map, now we've switched off that dynamic sizing just for this one map. So we've got one map here where we've switched off that. So that's one way we could approach this problem of saying we don't want that dynamic sizing, that dynamic bolding in one particular map. The problem with this approach is it's really becomes a maintenance nightmare. We've got our rule here is starting to include things, logic, or it's starting to include parts of the rest of our project. So it's got this hard-coded thing in here to say when the map ID is state layout map. If I went and I changed that map layout ID, I'd have to remember to go back and change all these data-defined overrides that might be referring to it, which is super tricky. It can take a lot of time. If you miss one, then you might break the layouts just subtly in a way that you don't realize until you actually see that map in production, and then you're like, ah. So this is the inferior way to approach this problem. Here's a better way to do it. If I was coming at this one and I had to say, some of my maps will have a big capital name, some of them won't. First off, I'd go into my project properties, put a default variable here. So this one will be called, let's call it use big labels for capitals. So I've made a new variable. It's called use big labels for capitals. The default value for this project for that one should be 1. So 1 means it'll be true. It'll like a yes value. Okay, so now I've got a project level variable for that. I'm going to change this. Bye. And instead of hard coding in that map ID rule, I'm going to just change this to say, let's tweak this a little bit. When my variable of use big labels for capitals is true, then we use our scale dependent sizing. Otherwise, we just use 13. Okay, so we've removed that hard-coded layout name that we had in there, and we're just saying use a variable now. So case when the variable value for use big layouts for capitals is true, then we use big labels for the capitals. Otherwise, we just use a hard-coded value of 13. So now in my canvas, we're still seeing the result we want. It's using that default value from the project. If I bring up a layout, not that layout, where was this one? In my layout, my default layouts are inheriting that value from the project context, so it's showing them in capitals. But if I go in here into this one particular map that I don't want them to show in its variables section, in its properties down the bottom, I'm going to add a new variable, which is use big labels for capitals, and this one is no. So now the project setting for that, the default one that was saying yes, is being crossed out. It's being overridden just for this one layout item to say no. Let's refresh that, and there we go. So what we've done is we've changed the logic from sitting entirely in my labels data defined thing with a whole lot of hard-coded values about this particular map, it shouldn't be like this particular map, it should be like this. We're now using variables and just overriding that variable for one particular map to say, actually, just for this map, let's switch it off. I could put another map in here. It should use the default setting. I could put a third map in here, and I could say, actually, for this map as well, I don't want it. So this is now a nice, easy fix. I can just say, put a new variable in here, override it for this one. And we've actually now changed it so that logic that was sitting hard-coded in a layer somewhere in our project is now directly visible or directly settable inside the layout item itself. So the toggle that lets me switch on or off that setting has been moved from sitting at the bottom of our project to sitting just at the item where it actually applies to. I like to use this sort of thing for cases when I want to hide just particular features from a certain map. So I might say in this map here, I don't want to see anything except for a few of like the most important ones. I'd use a similar setup and basically put a rule-based renderer in on my places one where it has an expression to say depends on it checks to see if an excluded labels variable is set, and if it is, then don't render it if the label text is part of that excluded labels variable. So that's sort of like one way you can also use this same sort of thing of like a setting options in the variables for a layout map, which apply all the way back down when it's rendering just for that map there. I've gone a bit over time, but maybe I'll have to do part 2 next time. This has just been a kind of whirlwind introduction to expressions and expression contexts and variables in QGIS. The most important takeaways, if you want to rewatch this video or if you want to make notes for yourself, you need to think about how those expressions are context dependent. So the same expression evaluated in multiple different parts of your project can end up with completely different results depending on the wider context in which that expression is evaluated. You also want to think about how those contexts are like building blocks, and they build up from your global variables with your project variables, and then you can have layout variables that override. And it's a bit like CSS in that the ones from variable values from higher in that stack override any that are set below that. And most importantly, if you set things up to use variables on a project level or on a inside your project, you can make these projects where you change one variable and it can apply to hundreds of different places in that project. So instead of having multiple parts, multiple settings scattered for a project that you have to update, you can pull that all back into one central place where you can make one change and update that whole project as a result. A couple of questions on the chat window. I've got one here about any places to read up on this topic. One place that I would recommend, if you go to Google, there's a blog post I wrote quite a few years ago. So if we search for Niall Dawson expression variables, you'll get a blog post from 2015 on my old blog. this all still applies, and this is a great written sort of summary of a lot of what we've talked about today. Looks tiny bit different because this was QGIS 212, but the actual all this stuff still applies. The windows will just look a little bit different. That's a good place to read up on it. Another one that I would highly recommend, which uses a lot of these concepts, is the book QGIS Map Design, second edition. Where are we? Here we go. QGIS Map Design, second edition from Locate Press. This one covers a lot of this kind of data-defined things and variables and expressions, and is fantastic. So that this is like it showcases different maps and then that were made in QGIS, and then it explains over the next couple of pages how they were actually put together. Fantastic for learning more about this sort of stuff. So QGIS Map Design by Anita Grazer and Gretchen Peterson, second edition, Locate Press. Great place to read up more on this one. I think that was all the questions that I had outstanding. Yeah, great. Thanks for joining. And let me know if you've got ideas for future ones like this that you really want me to explore in depth. Make a comment on the YouTube video, and we'll see what we can do next time. Thank you very much.